Thank you, Ceann Corla, and I thank all the members for contributing to the debate and also in terms of the points that were raised. One thing I find interesting is the number of deputies who said the legislation was meaningless and that it would not serve the purpose that it is intended to do, and yet they were very clear that they are voting for the bill. So that seemed very strange from the outset. And secondly, I just want to refer specifically what Deputy O'Callaghan said in connection with the number of bills that we have brought in to the House in relation to protecting renters. And it's something I did reference in my opening speech when I stated we had 6 previous times come to the House through the pandemic to date under the 33rd Dáil. But I want to be very clear, and I was very clear in my speech, that Deputy O'Callaghan tried to make that out as if I was boasting about these pieces of legislation. I absolutely was not, and I made it very clear in the speech of why the last piece, which was introduced in July in terms of linking the rental increases to inflation, as to why it did not work. And I outlined the reasons for that. We are trying to respond to try and keep people in their homes, to keep rents as stable as we can in a very challenging environment through COVID-19. And that's what we are solely focused on in the department through these pieces of legislation, trying to respond to these challenges. So I just want to be very clear in my terms. I was very clear in the past in this House in terms of the dysfunctional nature of the rental market. I'm also very clear in my mind as someone who attends a very busy clinic in my own constituency office on a weekly basis, listening to very vulnerable people who are at their wits' end, concerned about the rental increases, the availability of rental properties, and critically, their future to get access to sustainable housing. And that is something that weighs heavily on me and the government as well. But I also just want to very clearly point out, when people come into this House and read out emails and give a detail of the very vulnerable constituents that we all meet right across this House. And I think it was Deputy O'Murku who referenced the single transferable speech. It's the first time, actually, I have to say, that I heard Sinn Féin refer to the single transferable speech, which they read out in this House. So I'd like to talk about the single transferable response that we see from Sinn Féin. The single transferable response in the first instance is ideology, object to housing. And we can see in terms of, if we look right around, in the first instance, a number of deputies referred to Oscar Traynor, the 854 units in Oscar Traynor, yet none of them referred to the political actions that surrounded that. And when we looked at that development where 4 parks, a mix of social, affordable and private housing was set out, mixed tenure, which is best for society, a community centre, childcare facilities, all under the one footprint. That was objected to by Sinn Féin. In the second instance, if you want to refer right down to Ballymastone, where 1,200 houses were objected to by Sinn Féin. And this is the nub of the issue, and this what really proves to me that Sinn Féin want the housing crisis to escalate. If we go over to Wicklow, we're told every time in this Dáil chamber it's public houses on public land. Well, they had a chance there to vote for public houses on public land. 18 public houses on public land voted down by Sinn Féin. So we have Sinn Féin and the Social Democrats. Their view is that any additional residential development is overdevelopment. That's what they say in their submissions when they're objecting. You have Sinn Féin voting down on our local authorities. Their response is object, object, object. I can see in government that the solution to increasing rents and our crisis is increasing supply, because in any marketplace where demand significantly outstrips supply, prices are going to go up. And the sole response, and the primary response is to increase our housing units. And the last thing we need is deputies objecting constantly to that and trying to come into this House and try and tell us that they have a monopoly on compassion, a monopoly on how to represent vulnerable people in society that we in the government benches meet every single day of the week trying to help. And yet they vote against public houses on public land. And those are facts. And I hear people trying to eulogise about the great actions and responses that Deputy O'Brien can have if he so has the honour of becoming the next housing minister. Well, we have to look at it in their manifesto in 2016, where they said very clearly that they would build 36,000 houses between 2016 and 2021. Well, the government actually delivered 39,000, but it did it a year earlier, by 2020. So what you would have got from Eoin O'Brien as a housing minister was a lot less than what you got from the previous government. So when you hear these views, I think people should actually look at the facts, see what these parties can deliver, but they can deliver one thing, and that's objection after objection. And another interesting thing I heard in the debate was in terms of landlords and in relation to why so many of them are exiting the market. 16,000 since 2016 left the marketplace. 85% have 2 or less properties. 75% have only 1 property. We need sustainable landlords in the housing market. But yet you hear Sinn Féin in their pre-budget submission proposing to put an additional tax of €400 on every unit that a second unit that an individual owns. So all those landlords that are trying to hold on with 1 property would face additional taxation through Sinn Féin. And Deputy O'Brien comes in and says, well, I don't know really why they're leaving, we're doing surveys, we're looking at this data. But we have to be clear, we need a sustainable rental market. It's critical, and that's what we're doing through our cost rental model, which will offer below rental market rents, sustainable tenures, through the €4 billion multi-annual budget which we have in the department, which is a record level in housing, and to have it multi-annual is a critical piece. I also want to refer to Deputy Fitzmaurice in relation to one-off rural housing. And I know from a very large rural constituency the importance of one-off rural housing. And I think what people in the debate failed to, in the first instance, is acknowledge and understand the demand for one-off rural housing as a sustainable form of housing, because the reality is in rural areas, people have businesses, as you referred to, in terms of agriculture, farming. I know in my own area there's a number of very large employers in rural areas. If I look at Green Farm Foods down in Rathdonnell, I go over to Castlepollard and see Murgon, Collinstown, CNF Tooling, all of those outside the main arteries of our town like Mullingar or Athlone. And you need sustainable options for people like that. So we are updating the 2005 Sustainable Rural Housing Guidelines, and that's going to form part of our work to try and offer a sustainable alternative for people to have that right to build in rural areas, to be part of their communities and keep the local school open and keep the shop open and enhance the GAA club. That's what we really want, to try and build mixed communities. And obviously as our housing increases, naturally it is a smaller component, because when we were only building less than 5,000 houses in our economy, rural housing was predominantly the majority of that. But as we escalate up to past 33,000, as we will in connection with the ESRI, we need to acknowledge, understand and permit rural housing in our rural areas. And I think we have to have a very reasonable policy to allow that, and I really articulated that over the summer. So in terms of this debate, just to conclude, Count Corla, I'm very grateful for the deputies that did give responses, that put forward their views. I'm grateful to the Joint Oireachtas Committee to how quick it brought forward and agreed with this legislation. I look forward to working with all the deputies in the House next week on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.